Hi, I'm David Baird, violin maker and Cremona revival researcher. In this video, we're diving in to explore the making methods and work principles used by Stradivari and the other great instrument makers from old Cremona, Italy. We'll look a bit at the history and origins of these instruments and methods. Most of all, though, we will actually read the design choices in 4 violins, the choices these makers used to create their instruments. In effect, we'll look over the shoulders of Stradivari and company as they lay out their designs and carve at the workbench. Today, we revere the great old Italian instruments. Yet, despite the importance, fame, and continued success of these instruments, mostly no one makes today using the old methods. The old Italian makers used traditional methods that differed greatly from what is common today. For each feature, they had traditions of geometry and proportions, recipes, if you will. Traditions of how to use a simple compass and rule to design and shape and proportion each feature. They didn't copy their shapes in the sense that is common today. A great range of instrument sizes and the types were designed and created using basically the same collection of shared recipes for similar features. Variations on the basic recipes gave the great diversity and range of results we see historically. Some recipe variations changed details of compass arcs and lines in the geometry. Most variations changed proportions and sizing. Fortunately, many of these instruments survive today. Without being able to examine and study large numbers of such instruments, seeing the outcomes of the maker's design choices physically evidenced in the wood, we wouldn't be able to recover the old methods. Today, we can learn about the methods of these old masters precisely because their making was so successful, and because so many of their instruments were cherished and protected over the years, surviving now and enabling our study. By looking across many example instruments of different types and from diverse regions and times, we can start to see how the old methods developed and how these methods worked. With general principles in hand, we can use this to examine or read particular design choices in a specific instrument. The basic recipes of geometry are one thing. The maker's choices and preferences in applying and using those recipes are another. The basic recipes were very stable, particularly in Cremona's making. The action, if you will, the development and evolution of their making, was more about their preferred choices in how they applied those recipes. These preferences are what changed and developed across the generations of Cremona making. The community developed preferred combinations of choices that they favored in applying the basic recipes for a feature. It was their choices in the optional parts of the recipes that evolved and developed, not the core basic recipes so much. And these choices are what we read when we study an instrument. By reading many Cremona example instruments, we can follow the trends and changes in which choices were preferred as their community traditions evolved. We can, in a sense, read the book of Cremona making by studying the surviving instruments. Of course, this reading of design choices opens some new possibilities. A long closed door has now opened a bit. Some might use parts of this recovered understanding to improve their copy making. But there's another possibility now. For those who wish, we can lay aside current ways and take up the old methods and principles. We too can again work out shapes by recipe and by making design choices traditionally and interactively as we build. Instead of just reading the book of old Cremona making, we have the opportunity to resume its story. In this video, we'll first explore some of the history, looking at the origins and success of these old traditional methods. Then, we'll consider how these methods got lost and eventually recovered. After that, we'll settle into reading the particular design choices in 4 violins from Cremona. We'll examine the 1610 Vuillaume by the brothers Amati, the Georgi Stole by Niccolo Amati, circa 1648, and Antonio's violin, the Harrison, from 1693, as well as Carlo Bergonzi's Salube from 1733. We're going to start by looking at the ancient roots behind historical instrument making. After all, Stradivari and Del Gesù didn't spring from nothing. Those famous makers worked within traditional methods, investing their instruments with an inheritance of generations and vast centuries of collective learning. Indeed, the violin emergence as one more instrument type formed by recombining features long explored and evolved in multiple lines of earlier instrument development. In this way, the violin family inherited deep roots and ancient learning. For the violin, much of this traces back to two main families of ancient instruments, the lyre and the long-necked lute. Later, making inherits developments and learning reaching back even to prehistory. An important variation of the lyre evolved in ancient Greek and Roman times. This new kithara tradition developed both specialized instruments and playing techniques. Over time, kitharas tended to elongate, eventually borrowing long necks and frets from the lute lines of instruments, an early example of recombination of features from different lines. A closely related medieval instrument emerged, the cithara, combining a constructed resonant body and top featuring sound holes and a bridge. A range of medieval and Renaissance types developed more or less directly from these instruments. Some of these lines, including the lyre da braccio, led toward the eventual violin family. Early European instrument types developed from these ancient world roots, but also from additional influences from around the world. Bowing appears to begin with Mongolian stick fiddles. Once it reached Europe, musicians tried bowing on basically every kind of instrument imaginable. A vast range of possibilities were explored and developed before the violin appears. Throughout the various lines of instruments, we see different combinations of features and shapes tried. We also see new lines of development drawing closer toward modern type instruments. Explorations were exhaustive and far-reaching. The first mention of actual violins occurs in Brescia, at the foothills of the Italian Alps, where the spruce for the instruments is harvested. Brescia was already an established instrument-making town. Around this time, Brescia was also famous for its early and secret European steel-making process, which presumably means they had some advantage in making and acquiring good carving tools. Around this time, Brescia was home to a good number of instrument makers making a wide range of instruments. And while we don't know exactly who made the first violin, we do know of a father-son team in Brescia with the last name Micheli. Some violins from the son, Zanetto, survive today. Violin making in Cremona itself starts with Andrea Amati. It's fair to say he gave the world the violin family that we know today. Moreover, the recipes of geometry and proportion he used became the foundation and the tradition for all later makers from Cremona. But it would also be wrong to call him the inventor of our violin family. That would seriously miss the point. What we repeatedly see in the old methods is a long evolution of tradition, never a casting aside or starting over. The founding Amati is no exception. We can see the roots and sources of Andrea's recipes in prior recipes of Brescia. Between Zanetto and Andrea, we don't actually know who made first. But what we can say is that Zanetto made with the earlier recipes, the simpler, more basic and prior recipes. All the ideas of old Brescian recipes are carried forward into the Cremona tradition, but with elaborated and evolved variations. Amati's recipes, and therefore Cremona's recipes, are a refined recasting of old Brescian recipes. Consider the geometry illustration here, and the diverse range of instruments all designed from this basic common recipe shape. All these examples show the same main geometry structure but with variations. Each shows different choices of sizing and proportion, and some of these also show secondary small differences in geometry. Some make the main waist circles join smoothly to the sides. Some add additional arcs to create corners, or to join smoothly into the neck, or to create a little dimple at the bottom of the instrument, etc. In making communities like Brescia and Venice, makers explored the larger scale variations that produce different body type shapes and different types of instruments. In contrast, Cremona making tended from its beginnings to focus on a much narrower range of recipe variations and mostly working within the violin family. Amazingly, the main families of Cremona making all lived and worked on one small plaza in the one town. These few families developed the violin to a peak success that has never been surpassed. The impact of their achievement was felt worldwide and continues today. From the beginning, the first several generations of Amatis continued refining and evolving Andrea's initial recipes. The great success of Cremona violins and their growing importance in musical culture meant more need for violins and more makers. Eventually, other families overshadowed the Amatis, but they were and remain the foundation of Cremona making. All the way through until after the peak of Cremona making, after 1750, the successes of each Cremona generation surpassed all prior making. The current notion that older violins are better didn't really show up until after that peak was over. And ever since, the best amount of aging has always just happened to coincide with however many years it takes to get back to those peak instruments. Before that, however, violins from Amati and his sons, the brothers, were of better design and immediately more valued than the older brescian design violins. Likewise, the violins of the third generation of Amati, Niccolò Amati, were an advance in the evolution of Cremona designs and are valued above the prior works of generations, and that was in their time, not at some later point. In turn, the next phase of Cremona work, the peak, surpassed that middle phase, and those instruments became the most valued when they were new made and have remained so ever since. To illustrate, there's an interesting exchange of letters between the famous scientist Galileo and a priest in Venice. Galileo wanted to buy a top quality violin for his nephew. The priest, acting as a go-between, advised that violins from Brescia are readily available, but that those of Cremona are incomparably better. Despite the time delays involved and the price being more than 3 times greater, Galileo opted to commission a new Cremona instrument. Monteverdi himself got involved. The very success of these instruments meant violin making continued to increase in numbers, both of makers and of instruments. Making and Cremona influence making expanded, dispersing outward from its Brescia-Cremona-Venice roots. But in that spreading out, the original Cremona influence grew more dilute. Instruments produced at the Cremona peak have remained the most celebrated and revered violin family instruments ever made. These creations continue to be instruments most favored by collectors, auction houses, and by artists on the concert stage. Even as standards for instrument setups and playing techniques changed, top musicians chose to have the old Cremona instruments adapted rather than settling for later-made instruments. The violin originated in the Renaissance. Those times gave way to the Baroque, the Galant, and then the Classical eras. Cremona violins stood at the foundations of all these developments, yet the very success of the Cremona violin family led to expansion and the dispersion not just of violin playing, but of violin making. Violin making meant different things in different regions. Making practices varied by region, by town, by family, and by individual maker. In Cremona, the making methods were exceptionally homogeneous. But in other communities, making practices were generally more diverse. When other communities tried to emulate the influential Cremona designs, their efforts were generally not entirely accurate in reproducing Cremona methods or results, and such efforts tended to compromise the local integrity, the continuity of their own distinct traditions and roots. Venice, of course, was a great trade center and highly diverse. But in Venice, and in some other towns in the regions near Cremona, we see a mix of makers using varied methods. Some are more independent from Cremona methods, or influenced by other styles. Yet some makers in Venice and other towns in the general region use methods extremely closely related to actual Cremona traditions. Even far afield from Cremona, we sometimes see a maker whose work is deeply related to the Cremona traditions. Steiner, for example, apparently trained in Cremona, taking those actual methods back to Absalom and then adapting them to better reflect tastes in his region. Brescia is different. Brescia already had its own long-established traditions of geometry and design recipes. However, with the rising success of Cremona violin family instruments, at a certain point, Brescian makers tried to make along those lines. Despite Brescia's strong geometric heritage, we see the younger Brescian generation transitioning and attempting to imitate the Cremona designs, but failing to sort out the proper recipes. At times, some of their efforts seemed to be just loosely freehand, without bothering to resolve any clean geometry. This, even though the actual Cremona recipes derived from Brescian roots. Years later, we see the Brescian makers did eventually learn the Cremona recipes for most features, directly adapting them. Curiously, bridge positions give us a further example of how dissemination of the Cremona violin model wasn't always complete. The Cremona violin design seems to have always intended a mid-position for the bridge, but as violin playing and making spread around Europe, this positioning doesn't always seem to have been universally adopted. Paintings from the time show a mix of bridge positions, even in works by painters who are otherwise exceptionally accurate. Is this just a common painter's error, or were such bridge positions actually used? I suspect this is an illustration of delayed or incomplete adoption of the full Cremona example. In the centuries before the violin, bowed strings had explored many possible bridge orientations. In areas outside full Cremona influence, this diversity seems to have continued for some time. We also find examples of active resistance to fully adopting the Cremona example. Particularly find such things in areas that had gone further down other lines of development before yielding to Cremona-style violin. Some areas, for example, went further into the Geigen lyre type instruments. Here we see an example instrument, a viola from Nuremberg, retaining a shield-type body shape and having the plates flush to the sides. This instrument was actually made once Cremona had already reached its peak. Along similar lines, late into the 19th century, we have the example of Ole Boll bringing aspects of the Hardinger tradition to his violin playing on the European concert stage. Considering Cremona's making's great success, we can fairly ask, how did these methods get lost? And partly it's the things we just looked at. The making methods and details of the instruments around Europe generally varied in greater or lesser degree from the Cremona example. These imitations by other methods are what actually spread in the largest numbers. Beyond that, economics shifted. Cremona methods emerged in a world of royal and church patronage. These were princely instruments worthy of boundless effort and ultimately best materials in their creation. With time, violin music flowered in an incredible way, but the new growing need was for lower cost instruments. Why were those great Cremona methods lost? The simplest answer is that times changed. As we've seen, the violin emerged somewhere around the early to mid 1500s. We don't know exactly when. This was an earlier time in music history, still pre-Baroque, late stages of the Renaissance. Leading minds were concerned with recently regained knowledge from the ancient world. Ratio proportions and the compass and rule geometry of Euclid were leading-edge topics. Music theory of the time explored the ratios of musical intervals, transforming the older medieval music theory into what would become the foundations for Baroque music. Cultural leaders like Isabella d'Este were calling for harmonious choirs of strings. The new violins emerged as one more combination of features in a bowed stringed instrument, but they developed into the perfect choir of strings. A little deeper into the 1500s, we have surviving violin examples. Music and the arts were highly patronized by both the courts and the church. Royal courts, particularly in France, start forming dance orchestras of violins and commissioning instruments. In Cremona, Andrea Amati is occupied making a family of violin-type instruments for a string of such royal commissions. In the first half of the 1600s, we see the dominance of the Amati family. Their instruments hold prominent place at the foundations of the emerging Baroque musical culture. Other regions join in violin making. In Cremona, the expanding Amati workshop starts training more and more makers. By the late 1600s and early to mid 1700s, we're already to the peak of violin making in Cremona and Venice. On the larger stage, we're squarely in the Baroque musical era, and early foundations of a more modern world are emerging. Also, social culture is changing. The time of church and royal patronage dominating arts, politics, and cultural life is drawing to an end. From roughly 1750 into the 1780s, we're in a different stage of things. The late Baroque is giving way to galant and pre-classical. We are past the peak of Cremona making. Making is entering a transitional phase. Old ways aren't gone, but they aren't continuing in the same way. Change is afoot. Slow change had always been there, a slow evolving of continuous tradition with ancient inherited roots. But now something subtly different was happening. There is a shift. Changes increasingly have a new character of innovation and of breaking away instead of developing from those long and previously continuous roots. The new nature of changes erupts in a host of events around 1800, dramatically illustrating this new character of innovation and of breaking with past roots. The new quite literally starts making a war with the past. Around 1770, Lorenzo Storioni founded a second Cremona school of violin making. This was not a direct continuation of the old making. Italy had gone through considerable military disruption after 1750, and the Austrians had broken up the old guild systems that helped preserve the continuity of the old making practices. Storione's methods in this second Cremona school were a reconstruction, following a serious disruption. In a similar time frame, making outside of Cremona, and even outside of Italy, continued developing and growing in importance, Lupo in France being an excellent case. We see various makers around Europe using methods that are neither fully broken from the old ways nor fully continuous with them either. In Beethoven's time, we have the interesting example of the Matagazza brothers in Milan. Again, this is a transitional situation. However, these brothers represent a direct, continuous line from Cremona at its peak. They were trained by their father, and he was trained by Landolfi, who had apprenticed in Cremona around 1730. Music had changed, and so had playing techniques and instrument standards. New bows were coming into favor, fingerboards were growing longer, high-position playing grew more important. Tastes for very large cellos, very large violas, and very small violins had all been shifting more toward our modern expectations. But also the peak of Cremona making had ended. The Matagazza's family business foreshadows the modern violin shop and violin trade. Unlike prior Italian violin houses focused on new making, the Matagazzas became very involved in modifying, adapting, and maintaining the old instruments. Paganini and Beethoven both straddle this transitional time of profound change. They both developed and came from the old ways, and yet they both were pivotal and foundation in opening up a new romantic musical culture. It's in this new early modern world that Jean-Baptiste Vuillaume comes in. I think it fair to call Vuillaume the father of modern violin making. Vuillaume was born in Mirecourt, where his father had a violin workshop. In 1818, he and a friend, Francois Chanot, moved to Paris to make Francois's innovatively designed guitar violins. Once in Paris, Vuillaume soaked up its many violin influences. Soon enough, Vuillaume opened his own shop, which grew into tremendous success. Vuillaume combines many disparate influences. There is his Mirecourt heritage, focused on lower-cost production methods, his innovative and scientific sides, and he was also greatly influenced by the fine maker-dealer houses in Paris before him, including Lupo. While Lupo did not necessarily copy in the modern sense the way Vuillaume did, Lupo was one of the first Paris makers to deeply emulate features and designs from Stradivari and other great Italian examples. It seems appropriate to regard Lupo as using French versions of the older methods to emulate aspects of the Italian masters. But in Vuillaume's hand, this reverence for the old making is instead expressed by using newly modernized methods to copy the masters in the sense commonly seen today. Vuillaume's business also shows the modern pattern of serving different distinct layers of the market. Beyond serving the vast need for lower-cost production violins and supplies, Vuillaume also served a middle ground with new-made instruments from his workshop. At the higher end of this middle ground, Vuillaume made bench copies of some of the great instruments. Vuillaume also served a top tier of collectors and artist players by importing, repairing, and promoting historical Italian instruments. With this new modernized approach to the violin trade and to making, we have in fact come face to face with a powerful paradox. In our modern world, we revere the old instruments and makers, yet we don't use their methods. Instead of following their old ways from the inside out, building with their recipes and methods, instead we use modern means to outwardly measure and imitate or copy specific example instruments. We do such copying even though it's a thing the old masters themselves never did. It's a paradox. We can look at the great figures at the foundation of this modern violin era. We see great love and involvement with the old instruments, their respect for the old makers. Yet, somehow, no matter how focused and devoted to the old masters, their journeys are away from the methods and principles of the old making. We might even ask if the old ways were actually forgotten, or did we somehow push them away and ignore them? Regardless, after a certain point, those old ways were lost and gone. Of course, copying in the modern sense can mean many, many things to different people. For some, merely putting a famous maker name on a label will raise the desirability and the sale price of a production violin, even if the label also says made in Korea. At another extreme, some have made extremely good visual imitations of historical instruments, fakes, with the intent to pass them off as the actual historical things and sell them at comparatively high prices. But in its most sincere form, copy work can lead to a desire to know more about the details and perhaps even the methods of historical instruments. And it is this impulse that put us on the road back toward recovering the actual old methods. Cicconi's 1972 book, The Secrets of Stradivarius, is a great example. Here, Cicconi shares something of what he learned from a lifetime of close work with historical instruments. This book took a giant step forward in exposing correct details and information about historical instruments and even artifacts from old Cremona, as well as opening a window onto the old methods and inspiring further work from others. Over the last 70 years or so, many have taken great strides and laid foundations for the recovery of the old methods. So why now? Why are the old methods recoverable now? The key difference is the internet. We can look across enough example instruments and ask enough questions with enough flexibility and freedom to ask any further questions that develop. For this reason, we can start to find answers and uncover what had been obscured. In the past, only the most privileged few people could ever see a large number of the old instruments, even across a lifetime, and no one had the freedom to ask a newly occurring question except with the few instruments that they might have current access to. In contrast, the image base I've collected and used for research ranges across more than 1,200 historical example instruments. This is a powerful difference from the past circumstances. No one, absolutely no one, had access to such a resource even just a few decades ago. This is why we can now work through the layers of complications and recover lost old methods, and why it wasn't possible earlier. And indeed, we see similar work recovering old crafts occurring across many fields now. To me, the second great essential is to seek to look from within a historical context, laying aside our modern perspective. Perhaps for someone else this might not be necessary, but for me it's been immensely helpful to take every possible step I can to look from a historical viewpoint. Spending time with historical texts can help, and it helps to realize violin making wasn't an isolated craft. It exists within a larger context of general arts and industries. Unfortunately, the older texts directly about violin making are not speaking from the center of the tradition. Even Cozio, who was of course focused on the great Cremona making, even he gives us more of an outside collector's viewpoint. Somehow Cozio's efforts are essentially opening a path toward a modern viewpoint and the modern violin trade, rather than opening a good window on the old methods. In our research, we can also learn from the various artifacts that exist. However, with many of these artifacts, it's tricky to know which workshop or era they belong to. While some of the artifacts are fairly clearly from Stradivarius, many are also clearly not, and others are from different makers, different known makers. These artifacts include a range of tools, molds, and templates. Many are now in the Cremona Violin Museum. Of course, the instruments themselves are our most important resource for research. What we found from researching is not entirely simple. It might be tempting to start at the end of the story to try to first understand Stradivarius and Del Gesù, but this makes matters more difficult. The methods at the peak of Cremona making are the endpoint of a long evolution of a continuous tradition. It turns out to be simpler and clearer to understand the broad shared principles first, and then learn how they get complicated and refined as the tradition evolves. What we find, most fundamentally, is that such historical instrument building, just as with other forms of old building, is rooted in simple geometry of arcs and lines, organized and governed by simple proportions and ratios of integers. We see this when the Roman architect Vitruvius describes how to build a war machine or gives proportions for the human body. He describes things by how their parts connect and relate to each other, and the simple integer ratios that give the parts proportional relationship and overall harmony. The illustrations here show some of the broad principles of such geometric design work. The one instrument is designed around a main circle, and if you put a frame around this circle, the frame is a square. The second instrument is instead designed around a pattern of overlapping circles known as vesicae. This is because in ancient times someone thought the overlapping part itself looked like a bladder. Notice that a frame around these vesicae circles would be a rectangle rather than a circle. In both cases, a line through the centers of the circles gives the widest part of the instrument. This basic vesicae pattern gives a maker a range of design options. You make two essential choices to form a vesicae. You choose a radius for the two circles, and you choose a gap between their centers. The ratios of these center gaps to the radius, that ratio gives a range of more square or more flattened out rectangular frames. If we force this to be simple integer ratios on the vesicae, then we get proportions of the type of radius to gap to radius, which we've illustrated here. In fact, if you make the gap nothing at all, you get the one circle in the square frame. Even though a single circle and the pattern of two overlapping circles might seem like different geometry structures, we can see how they actually form a sensibly connected range. In this kind of combination of a geometry structure and a choice of integer ratios in applying the structure, in this we see the basic materials of most all the historical instrument recipes. In the first instrument, we also see how the Soundhole was designed using simple ratios for the main circle to give both its size and position. All these things are common themes in historical instrument making. Lastly, let's notice in this first instrument that even though we see how the shape is made by simple means, just arcs and very simple relationships, even so, some complicated things incidentally are created. As we study instrument geometry, and we don't know where to begin, it's always important to search out the solid, simple understanding. If we pick things up from the wrong end, it will look more complicated than it really is. It's valuable to realize that if any geometric ordering is used to design something, that ordering will also create many side effect incidental relationships. Then these don't necessarily help you actually understand what's happening. Here, for example, if we compare the length and the width of this rectangular frame around the shape, they form a strange incidental ratio. If we call the width 2 and we calculate everything out, then it turns out that the length would be 4 minus the square root of 2. When we just start studying such a design, we might get confused and think that this complicated ratio had something to do with the actual designing. But on reflection, we can see that this complicated relationship is merely a side effect. Such side effects occur frequently, but they're tricky and deceptive. They are real and there. You can measure them and point to them, but they have no place in the actual making or designing. They don't help us understand, and so it's very important to dig through until you actually find the simple understanding of the structure. The real historical design methods tend to be direct and simple in their own way, just as we've seen here. The historical methods use the simplest combinations of arcs and lines governed by simple integer relationships. A further big general principle is that nothing in the historical making is a brand new invention. It isn't a story of maverick individuals cutting new ground. It's a story of traditions developing slowly. Here, for example, we see that even something like the F shape of a violin soundhole, it had a long history before it, and it just traces back as sort of rearrangements of those basic starting materials. For the most part, the continuity of these traditional methods was captured in broadly shared geometric recipes. Variations on these recipes gave the great range of instrument types seen in historical making. All this talk of tradition and structure and recipes might give the impression that the designs were prescribed or imposed on the makers. But that isn't really the case. The makers remain very much in charge. Much was prescribed by tradition. A feature would have established recipes of how to use compass arcs, lines, and proportions to govern the shapes and carving. But these recipes presented layers of optional choices to the maker. Even though these options also were structured by tradition, these choices left the maker very much in command of their results. In some situations, there were choices about actual use of lines and arcs, but in basically every situation, there were choices of ratio. Usually, there was some traditional structure to the ratio choices, so the maker essentially picked between a limited number of options that were traditional for the feature. For example, relate this part to that one by either 3:4, 4:5, or 5:6 ratio. That's a limited range of choices, not sort of like a free choice, but it's still a choice. These choices of ratios in the work gave the maker a primary layer of discretion and freedom in making. As a secondary layer of discretion, makers generally had free choice about how to apply the calculation of such ratios. So, for example, if there's a margin, do I calculate a ratio from the outer edge or from the inset margin? These things were the maker's choice traditionally. Curiously, the ratio options in recipes tend to be structured in an odd way. The patterns of ratio options tended to be expressible as differences by a part. So, for example, in our prior example, we had 3:4, 4:5, and 5:6. All of those are different by one part. 3 and 4, 4 and 5, 5 and 6, all differ by a part. We also might consider the common historical ratios of the neck stop to the body stop. In many earlier examples, these tend to be a 1-to-1 ratio, or ratios that are apart different from 1-to-1, as shown in the illustration here. In later making and in the violin family, we instead see ratios that are 2-to-3 as sort of the archetype, and then differences by a part from that. And so both of those formulations give ranges of choices for the neck stop. But these ranges of choices, the variation is based on differences by a part. We will see such patterns of ratio options organized as differences by a part. We'll see this pop up in many traditional design recipes. More generally, it's healthy to remember that the violin family and Cremona making methods inherit from the whole broad range of historical instrument making, not just from one or two narrow lines of that evolution. Along these lines, I want to point out how distinct the violin top is from the general assembly of the rest of the instrument. From a modern perspective, we might easily underappreciate this distinction. But looking at the historical lines of instruments, it's clearer. In the modern sense of building, we assemble the body as sides, back, and top, and then we attach a neck. And this encourages us to think in that way, thinking of the top as part of the body and then the neck as a separate thing. This approach helps us in modern building because we have no elevation wedge the way the Baroque instruments did. So we have to get the neck angled just right to the body, and so it's helpful to have the body assembled. But that viewpoint runs contrary to the long history. In many lines of development, the difference is much clearer. The assemblage of the sides, back, and neck are more of a single unit, and the top is something different. It's a later piece. It's laid into this structure of the body and neck, or laid on top of it, and it's even distinct in the material choice. This distinction is less overt in violins, but it's still probably worth our consideration. Okay, we're ready to start looking at actual design choices in these four violins. I've picked these four because they cover a wide portion of the main Cremona period, from the 1610 brothers all the way to the 1733 Carlo Bergonzi. They're quite similar in many respects, but each has its own little differences that we'll see. We're going to begin by looking at body outline choices. And there are sort of stages of this. The body outline is fairly complicated, and it's something that actually a maker ends up doing repeatedly during the process of building. You do it when you design a mold, you do it when you prepare the outline for the back, you do it again when you prepare the outline for the top. So it's something that one wants to be familiar with. And we're going to sort of separate this into three parts. So we're going to say that you make a number of choices that give the sizing and the framing of the design, and then you work some geometry that give the curves, overall curves, and then you work some further detailed geometry that gives you the corners and the way the shape rises up to join those corners. So our first thing is to look at sizing. In general, Cremona instruments covered a fairly wide range of sizes, and we're going to express this in their own old terms, in terms of the oncia. We're used to using millimeters to show these things, but they had sort of an inch. It is roughly 40 millimeters long. Okay, so let's take this old oncia unit and look at the choice of body length in these four violins. In the first one, in the 1610 Brothers Amati Vuillaume, we see the body choice is 8 3/4 oncia length. And in the Niccolo Amati, we see 8 2/3 oncia. And in the Harrison Strad, it's 8 11/12, or 8 11 points. In the Carlo Bergonzi, it's 8 2/3 oncia again. And we put these all together, and we want to notice a couple things. One, again, the choice here for the body length of a violin, as we've pointed out, many of these choices have a range of options for the maker, and the options are generally expressible in differences by a part. So notice that all of these are 9 oncias less a part. So 2 of them are less 1/3 of an oncia, one's less 1/4 of an oncia, and the Harrison, which is Stradivarius' long model, is only less what they call a point, which is 1/12 of an oncia. So our makers end up setting the width of the instrument in a proportional relationship to the length they chose. I'm showing here the most common ratios used in the Cremona tradition, giving a range of stout to skinny instruments. I'm not going to go into the logic of how that range is structured, but it can be summed up in the phrase, the width to the length is a part stouter than 1 to 2. Here in the 1610 Vuillaume, we see a 5:9 ratio employed. In the George Stoll, we see a 4:7 ratio applied. Again in the Harrison, 4:7, and again in the Bergonzi, 4:7. When we look across these, we see that the usage of the inset, represented by the purfling, and the outer edges isn't straightforward or simple. All of the body length choices were done on the inset, but some of the ratios involve the outer edges also. If we look at those purflings and edges, there basically are 2 choices involved here. One is the ratio between the inset and the width of the purfling. We see in the first 3 instruments that the purfling width is 1/3 the inset. Carlo Bergonzi, however, uses the inset is twice the width of the purfling instead. The other choice is the actual width of this structure. We see in the Bergonzi and the 2 Amatis that the inset is basically 1 point. That's the scale that's shown there. But in Stradivarius' instrument, he did it slightly differently. The inset plus the purfling overall are 1.5 points. So the choices we've already seen set some of the major dimensions of the instrument. And this is done with a mix of directly choosing sizes in the old system of oncia and points, and then deriving some sizes by ratio relationship. And we've already set the overall length and width of the instrument, as well as the dimensions for the insets. We're next going to want to set the width of the upper bout and the width of the center bout. But before we do that, let's look at how the Cremona tradition puts some constraints, particularly on the choice of the width of the upper bout. So we already have a length and width. That implies sort of a square around the lower region, a structural square. If we also make a square around the upper width, we want those two squares to at least meet or preferably overlap. This is necessary because in the Cremona tradition, the narrowest point of the instrument, the waist, is always within that little overlap. So when we go and actually look at some of these instruments, it's a little complicated. They use basically ratios most of the time to pick these further dimensions, but they also occasionally will mix in a direct choice in terms of oncia. And we see this in the 4 instruments and the various choices that they've made in these particular instruments, which are summarized in this table. Here we see the waist choices for the 4 instruments. The waist is always placed within the overlap of the upper and lower bout squares. Overlap itself runs usually from a little more than 4 insets in width down to just barely touching. Here we see a range of examples. The brothers Amati have an overlap of 1 inset wide. Nicola Amati's is a little less than 4, a little more than 3, somewhere in between there. With the Harrison, they just barely touch, which is the extreme range case. And with the Bergonzi, we have something very typical of later Cremona work, where the overlap is a good 4 insets wide. It's very common for the waist to actually be dead center amid this overlap. And that's true in all of these except for the brothers Amati, where it occurs at the bottom of the overlap. Now we've seen the sizing and framing choices in these 4 violins, and we'll take a look now at the main geometry choices these makers used in fleshing out the shape. The working out of body outline geometry is something that happens at several stages of the making in classical making, even though it never happens in copywork, because in copywork, you're just copying an existing outline. But with this classical approach, you're actually working the outline, and you're working it at several stages. You're working it when you design a mold, and then you're working it when you prepare to carve the back, and again you work it for the top. And when you're doing the outline for the back and the top, it's not entirely a free choice. You have your intentions, which the framing we looked at show those intentions, but you're also having to reconcile to something that already exists. So when you make the back, the sides have already been built, and they've been etched onto the board for the back, and you make an outline that reconciles between your intentions about the framing and the actuality of the sides you actually have. And the first step in this is setting the long arcs, the lower and the long arcs. These are set by their radius as a portion of the back length. And then the next step is to set the vesicae, which is done both in the upper and the lower bouts. And these are done by proportions. So you have the radius of the vesicae circles and the gap, and then a radius again. So you have a 3-part proportion, like 3, 2, 3. And we see that in these examples. We see their choices here in these example instruments. Now is the time to look at the corners and how those are resolved, and how risers are created to join between the bout shapes and the corner shapes. This is probably one of the more arcane aspects of the tradition. It's stuff that has convoluted historical origins, but basically the work is done in 3 parts. One is deciding where the corner will be placed. 2 is resolving the corner with some circle arcs. and then ad hoc risers are created to join smoothly to that. And we're going to look at these things. The placement is determined by a collection of redundant guides that suggest where the corner should be, combined with the facts of where the sides, the physical sides during the build actually are. And again, we're getting into the asymmetries and the naturalness of the Cremona method, where they don't necessarily, or they don't push things back into a planned place, rather they follow. So these methods are about accommodating the following of where a corner ends up, as opposed to imposing that place. You can pause and read the screens for more details. But essentially, the corner placement, there are a number of traditional guides that suggest where the corner should be. So there are guides that suggest the level along the length of the body. The upper corners are close to 1/3 down the body, or perhaps a little lower down than that, but very near to that. And then the lower corners are 2/5 up the body in a violin, or again, a little closer to the center, but generally very near that mark. So that's one guide. There also are arcs coming up from the bouts and down from the bouts, bout arc guides that are sort of reminiscent of the old shield violins, and they basically suggest that the corners should be essentially where they would have been in an old shield-shaped instrument. And then there are cross guides that go between the proportions along the bout, main bout lines, and from the centers of the center bout circles. And those cross lines also strongly suggest where the corner should be. And then there are secondary guides that can help confirm the place or nail down a specific location. We've already mentioned asymmetries several times, but with corner work, that's one of the places where it can really be very strong in classical work. It's not that they're trying to be asymmetric, but they are also not trying to correct any vagaries or asymmetries that arise during the course of the work. And corners are sort of like at the end of a tail. Little movements at the root can really whip them around. And little deviations in the way the sides came off the mold lead to deviations in the plan in the back, lead to stronger deviations in the top, and corners can be quite dramatically asymmetrical. The front and backs of these classical instruments don't automatically match. Again, there's this principle of following and accommodating and absorbing the little vagaries that develop rather than chasing them away. Once placed, the corners are actually shaped using circle arcs, principal circles and sometimes helper circles. The radiuses of these circles are a part of generally the great circle's radius, the circle that gave us the main arc of the center bouts. But it can, at other times, it can be, they can be portions of the upper or the lower bout width. That happens also. Risers then consist of arcs coming from a proportion of the bout length from that line, and sometimes there's a straight line segment helping them connect. But we'll see these in the 4 example instruments that you were seeing here, and then they're summarized in the tables at the end. So that completes our reading of design choices in the outline of these 4 instruments. And next we'll look at choices in the scroll work in the head. Once again, we're going to at times go very quickly through the screens, and if you want full detail, just pause and read through them. The 2 things I want to bring out here at the beginning of this is that the basic geometry methods for the scroll and the head here that were used in Cremona, they're basically the same geometry structure that was already happening in the older brescian style, and there are just some small differences in the implementation of that. And then I also like to point out here that the volute itself is generally framed either in a 3:4 proportion or a 4:5 proportion. Here we can see the choices our 4 makers took to frame the head and give it its basic side outline shape. It starts with setting up some reference lines and putting a frame for the volute. In all these cases, it's a 3x4 frame, though we see in violas and other examples occasionally a 4x5 frame. The next step is to set a key arc. This is the arc under the volute, and this is done by locating its center by proportional choice. Further arcs and reference frames are used to give the main arc for the peg box and the under arcs under the peg box. The volute itself is composed of a series of arcs smoothly joined and coming into a center eye. The eye itself is placed and sized by proportional choices, and the arcs are positioned and sized by choices of the radius and choices of boundaries for them. The further we move in toward the center of the volute, the more interactions with the margins play a significant role. So the recipes of old Cremona making provide structure to the work. They provide a structure to the way the maker carries out intentions. But that's not quite sufficient. It's also, their preferences are also significant in this, and there are certain extra things that they aim out for that aren't explicitly guaranteed by the recipes. So for example, in the volute, there's generally created a sense of the arcs being concentric in the sort of top leading edge there, because those arcs don't, they share, their centers are in a line, and they don't change their radius during that portion of the curves. And then another thing is that the classical Cremona volute isn't really a spiral. It doesn't continuously get tighter. It has these sections where the radius stays constant for a stretch. And further, it's unusual for it then to get wider as we go in. We do see one spot in the Bergonzi where it gets a little wider into the lower curve there. But that's an unusual occurrence in the Cremona making. Generally, there are some spots where the distance between the curves stays constant for a stretch, and then it gets tighter, and it gets tighter, and then it's constant for a stretch, and it gets tighter, but it usually never retreats. All of these things are part of why Cremona work looks the way it is. It is not just the recipes, it's the recipes plus preferences, plus a few guiding ideas. So we've taken fairly complete looks at reading the design choices in the outline of the instruments and in the head and the scroll. But there are other areas where there are design choices that we can read off of instruments. Some of these other areas we can read in most any instrument that has images available. Others require special circumstances to be able to read those things. We know that the Cremona making was very thorough in using geometry and ratio basically everywhere you could. It's like a habitual thing that, somebody might always measure every cut they make with a ruler, and they might measure every time in millimeters, and that might be a habit they have. Well, working with geometry of arcs and lines and simple integer proportions to govern everything seems to have been an habitual thing with the Cremona making tradition. We're going to look at some of these things, not in as much detail as we just did, but we're going to start with the arching geometry. The arching is a little different because it's a three-dimensional problem. So they use a technique that's related to boat building, where instead of being able to specify every point on a hull, you specify some points, and then you use the idea of smoothness to connect and develop that into a three-dimensional shape. Important things to notice about the Cremona arching method is that there's a channel running all the way around the instrument where it dips down and then comes back up, and that shape is governed by simple arcs. And then the main cross arcs, some control points can be established using a recipe of 1/2 fall in 2/3 run is the way I say it. But that's illustrated here. You can stop the screens to see it in more complete detail. But that gives a number of control points, and then you connect smoothly through those. Just as a side note, some Cremona making seems to just use a simple radius, but most of them doesn't. Most of them you see a flatter radius at the top that then tightens coming down and then smooth out again, and that's what is described here. Reliable plate thicknessing information is harder to come by. What you see here is composite images from some computer imaging that the Smithsonian did of a number of Del Gesù and Stradivarius instruments, and I've composited the Del Gesùs and the Stradivariuses separately. What we see in the tops is basically a uniform diaphragm thickness throughout the instrument with a little bit of drifting of about 0.3 millimeter throughout. There might be just a touch of extra thickness at the very center of the instrument, but not between the upper eyes in Stradivarius's tops, perhaps. And then in the backs, of course, we see the strong extra thickness in the back. It's a little higher up in the Stradivari than it is in the Del Gesù. And in the Del Gesù, he doesn't connect that extra thickness to the outer edges. It has like a center coin of thickness, and then they taper out to the general diaphragm thickness. But Stradivarius connects a little of that extra thickness to the edges, whereas Guarneri elongates the thickness but doesn't connect it to the sides. In observing the long arcs of the top and the back, we use, again, a boat builder's technique of related to lofting. Basically, we note relative heights along a division of the length. The main observation here is that the backs reach a peak in front of the bridge area, in front of the post, that is very short, and then they descend fairly directly. Whereas with the tops, the long arc is flattish for a rather long stretch, usually going all the way into the corners or beyond, and then comes down. There are, of course, more things one can read in these Cremona instruments. But the main point is to recognize that they did this work by making traditional choices in a structured way. It wasn't random. They were exploring preferences and details within the tradition, but they also inherited this structure, and that's what we're able to look at and see. We'll end here by giving a little focus to the Soundhole area, and particularly noting how significant the low cut is. That's the line below the bottom curve of the F-holes. That low cut is generally set by dropping a significant distance down from one of the center lines. Very typically, it's it's 2/9 of the body length down from something like the lower bout square line. There are many variations that are seen, but that's a very common choice. Once that low cut line is established, many of the other features of the Soundhole measure from that. So, for example, the width of the island is generally the same as the distance from that low cut up to some other significant line in the middle region. Very commonly, it's the low cut up to the waist that gives you a length that then becomes the width of that island area. We did it. Thank you for taking this journey with me. You've made a very big step into reading the design choices of the classical Cremona violin makers. You have begun reading the book of old Cremona making. And again, I thank you for joining me on this journey.